Life under occupation. After the Union Army arrived in July 1862, Helena was no longer part of the Confederacy. It was in Union hands, and the Union commander made law and policy. The Moore Horner home across the street was one of many in Helena seized by the Union Army. Family homes become Army headquarters. Arthur S. Thompson built the house in 1860. When the Union Army marched into Helena, the house was empty, the family having fled to Kentucky. The Army seized this and other abandoned houses, including Confederate General Thomas C. Hyman's, for use as officer quarters and office space. Families that remained in Helena, such as the Ryder and the Richardson families, housed Union officers, whether they wanted to or not. Living under martial law, the Union Army controlled every aspect of civilian life in Helena. Union commanders decided who could buy and sell cotton. In 1863, General Benjamin Prentiss forbade trade with people living outside of Helena. Residents could not leave the city with goods. Those who refused to take the oath of allegiance could not come into the city to buy goods. At least one resourceful young woman smuggled food past the Union sentries, concealing it under her petticoat. Our dread is that our necessities will compel us to take the oath of allegiance to the Lincoln government. It is deeply repugnant to every feeling in our hearts. Mary Sell Edmondson, who lived outside of Helena. USCT in Helena. On April 6, 1863, Adjutant General Lorenzo Thomas made a speech at Fort Curtis, seeking to enlist former slaves into the U.S. Army. The next day, hundreds of black men joined the 1st Arkansas Infantry, African descent, later designated U.S. Colored Troops. These soldiers took an active role in winning freedom for Arkansas slaves. The 54th, 57th, and part of the 69th USCT were raised from Phillips County men. USCT were in Helena from April 1863 until war's end. The USCT faced hardship and prejudice, but fought well and served with distinction. Arkansas Civil War. Sequential Commission. Civil War, Helena. Helena, West Helena Advertising and Promotion Commission. Preserve America National Park Service, Department of the Interior, 2013. Defending Helena. Shortly after the capture of Helena in July 1862, the Union Army took measures to protect the city. Engineers designed a large earthen fort, which African American laborers completed in October 1862. General Benjamin Prentice named the heavily armed fort for the city's first Union commander, General Samuel Curtis. Construction begins. Within weeks of the Union Army's arrival in Helena, engineers began work on a large redoubt and enclosed earthwork. They sited the earthen fort on high ground at the end of a ridge in 1862. The fort stood 3 blocks north of here, just west of the city. Picture to the left, the guns in Fort Curtis, like the guns in Fort Stevens above, fired over the wall of the fort rather than through opening cuts into the wall. Picture 2. The guns at Fort Curtis look like these seen here in seacoast mounts on the ramparts of Fort Troughton near Washington, D.C. Fort Curtis's formidable guns. Engineers designed the impressive fort to protect Helena from attack. Huge guns brought by Mississippi River steamboats bristled from the ramparts. The Army hoped that the formidable weapons would cause the Confederates to think twice before attacking. 6 24-pounders and 1 32-pounder cannon armed Fort Curtis. The 32-pounder gun alone weighed 7,200 pounds and could fire a projectile over a mile. Picture 3. 7 Union soldiers stand next to a 32-pounder cannon in a fort that protected Washington, D.C. Who built Fort Curtis? Thousands of escaped slaves, known as contraband, followed the Union Army to Helena in 1862. Within weeks, the Army put hundreds of contraband to work building Fort Curtis. Hard labor and hot weather. African American laborers moved tons of earth, cut trees, milled lumber, and did everything else required to build Fort Curtis. Imagine moving enough dirt to build this fort with only shovels, picks, and wheelbarrows. Then imagine doing this back-breaking work in the hottest months of the year. The men who came to Helena seeking freedom did just that, building a fort larger than this reconstruction in 3 months. Seized and set to work. Parties of Union soldiers seized African American men, including those working for the Army in other jobs, and set them to work on Fort Curtis. General Eugene Carr, an advocate for the contraband, complained to General Curtis, writing, "It would be better to send orders through the proper channels than to send parties to gather them, contraband, wherever they may be found." Carr felt that the Union Army's actions sent the wrong message about freedom, saying, "There is no security for those who in good faith have engaged in labor in our service." Fort Curtis, 1862 to 1867. The Confederates tested Fort Curtis once, during the Battle of Helena on July 4, 1863. The battle ended in a decided Union victory. For the rest of the war, Fort Curtis stood over Helena as a symbol of the power of the Union Army. The Battle of Helena. Fort Curtis signaled the beginning of the Battle of Helena and was the last line of defense for the Union Army. In the pre-dawn hours of Independence Day, a single gun at Fort Curtis fired, the signal for the soldiers to take their battle stations. The 33rd Missouri Infantry, who had been trained to operate artillery, manned the guns. After taking Battery C, the Confederates attacked Fort Curtis, but they could not take it. First picture. The United States flag in the background stands in the middle of the Fort Curtis. The fort walls are visible behind St. John's Episcopal Church. The end of Fort Curtis. The Civil War ended in April 1865. A few months later, the Army removed the huge guns from Fort Curtis and shipped them out of Arkansas. The last inspection in 1866 found the Fort Curtis in good repair, but its usefulness had passed when the Union Army left Helena in 1867. It was abandoned. The fort was eventually leveled, its walls used to fill perhaps. The First Baptist Church 3 blocks north of here now stands near where Fort Curtis once stood. Second picture. General Samuel Curtis, the first Union commander of Helena, for whom Fort Curtis was named. Ditch and sliding bridge. Fort Curtis had several features that hampered an enemy assault. The first was a ditch 10 feet deep that encircled the fort. A bridge mounted on rails, indicated by the darker brick in the wall at your feet, allowed soldiers to cross the ditch. In the event of an attack, soldiers slid the bridge into the sally port, exposing the ditch. Picture. The sliding bridge taken from an Army engineer's Civil War drawing of Fort Curtis. Imagine it is 1862. The new Fort Curtis provides a glimpse into the changes the Union occupation brought to the Civil War, Helena. Look at its massive earthen walls and imagine the effort it took. Hundreds of refugee slaves pressed into labor to build the original Fort Curtis. The number and size of the reproduction guns is a visible reminder of the might of the Union Army. Seeing the parade ground, you can imagine Union soldiers drilling and standing for inspection. Sally Port. You are standing in the Sally Port, the entrance to the fort. The narrow Sally Port protected the fort defenders from the enemy's soldiers trying to get into the fort. If the enemy got across the ditch, the narrow Sally Port funneled them into the magazine, which caused a bottleneck. This allowed the fort's defenders to maximize their firepower while minimizing their attackers. Picture: the Sally Port and drawbridge shown in this wartime image are similar to the system that protected Fort Curtis. Main Magazine. A magazine held powder and shells for the fort's cannons. The powder stored 8 feet below the top of the magazine. The earth acted as insulation, helping to minimize damage if a shell hit the magazine, causing the powder inside to explode. Fort Curtis's magazine also served as an obstacle that helped secure the fort's entrance. Picture: we know the magazine at Fort Curtis stood in this area, but not what it looked like. The magazine in the Civil War photo taken at the fort in Alexandria, Virginia, served as the model for this reconstruction. Well, because people and animals must have water, most forts had wells. It was important to have water available inside the fort in the event of a battle or siege when the men inside could not leave. The well at Fort Curtis was 64 feet deep. Picture: soldiers at the well in Fortress Monroe, Virginia, 1861. Flags over Fort Curtis. When the Union Army built Fort Curtis in 1862, The 34-star flag flew over the fort. The day the Battle of Helena was fought, July 1863, the 35-star flag became the official U.S. flag. The new stars represented West Virginia, admitted into the Union on June 20th, 1863. This is the flag that flies overhead. The Union Army continued to man Fort Curtis after the Civil War, so it also flew the 36-star flag, which became official on July 4th, 1865. The new star represented Nevada, admitted to the Union on October 31st, 1864. Picture: these flags are the official style adopted by the military. Until 1912, neither the order of the stars nor the proportion of the flag was prescribed. Flags with the stars arranged in a circle, star, or other patterns were common. Parade ground. The parade ground is the open interior area of a fort. It was used for drilling ceremonies and addressing the troops. In the spring of 1863, Union soldiers crowded the parade ground of Fort Curtis to hear the Adjutant General Lorenzo Thomas speak. Thomas told the men that the Army was recruiting freemen into the Union Army. Within a week, enough black men in Helena volunteered to fill a regiment, and enough white men volunteered to officer it. Picture: this image shows a ceremony at Fort Sumter, South Carolina. Union Colonel Robert Anderson, who surrendered the fort to the Confederacy in April 1861, raised the U.S. flag over the fort again during the ceremony held on April 14, 1865. The guns. 7 large guns, or cannons, protected Fort Curtis. The muzzles of 6 24-pounders and 1 32-pounder extended over the fort walls. The pounder designation meant that the cannon fired 24 or 32-pound balls respectively. These large guns were usually found at coastal forts where they provided defense against well-armed ships. Fort Curtis's guns never fired on a ship, but they helped repel the Confederate soldiers who attacked Helena on July 4, 1863. Picture: the twin fort below New Orleans mounted large guns like those in Fort Curtis. Revetments and rampart. The vertical and horizontal planking. In front of you is the revetment. These upright and board hold the soil that formed the earthen walls in place. The level platform of earth beneath your feet is the rampart. As you can see, the rampart encircles the parade ground and holds the gun platforms. During an attack, soldiers stood on the rampart to fire over the wall. Picture: the revetment at reconstructed Fort Curtis is very similar to Fort No. 12, a Union fort that stood near Atlanta during the Civil War.